Before this story continues, please allow me to make one thing clear. The story you are about to hear is a work of fiction created for entertainment and educational purposes, reflecting toxic family conflicts and the inner journey of a woman who endured silence for far too long. All characters' events and details are entirely fictional and do not represent any real individuals or real situations. The content may be supported by AI tools during the creative and production process. This story does not promote violence, hatred, or harm of any kind. It is told to evoke empathy, reflection, and personal growth, especially for women who have sacrificed, endured, and been hurt within their own families. The entire narrative is built to be advertiser-friendly and compliant with YouTube community policies, and it does not aim to defame, attack, or imply any real person. If you recognize a part of your own life in this story, stay until the end. And if your heart is touched, share your feelings in the comments or follow the channel to continue with stories for women who have endured deeply yet still deserve understanding and respect. My name is Tess Callahan. I was 25 years old, living in Dublin, a quiet suburb just outside Columbus, Ohio. I worked an office job most people forgot 5 minutes after hearing about it. Operations coordination, spreadsheets, deadlines, paperwork that only mattered when something went wrong. I was the quiet one in the house. Richard Hale, my stepfather, was 58 and believed money was proof of character. My mother, Linda, was 53 and believed silence kept families intact. Brandon, Richard's son, was 32 and somehow always between plans, jobs, and second chances. It was March 2023, right before spring break, and we were sitting at the kitchen table with the local news murmuring from the TV, garlic bread cooling on the counter, and the smell of grilled chicken still hanging in the air. Richard slid a single sheet of paper across the table toward me, like it was nothing, like it was a grocery receipt or a menu. He said it was simple, just something he needed so he could refinance the house. He said it casually, the way people do when they want you to stop asking questions. I picked it up and saw the language immediately waver: acknowledgement, no financial contribution, no future claim. It was a paper that erased me quietly. Before I could say anything, Richard leaned back in his chair and looked at me with that half smile he used when he thought he was being generous. "You will never touch my money again." He said it slowly, clearly, like he wanted the sentence to settle into my bones. My mother did not look at me. She stared at her plate and said, "We just need to get this done so we can move on." Brandon snorted from his phone and said, "She will mess it up if you let her handle anything." My chest tightened so fast it felt like my breath caught halfway in. That moment was sharp and clean, like something snapping. I laughed. Not because it was funny, not because I was relieved. I laughed because the sentence was so certain, so confident, and so wrong that it startled something loose in me. I laughed and let him finish talking. Richard took that as permission. He always did. He started explaining how refinancing worked badly. He talked about rates, equity, cash out like they were trophies. He talked about responsibility and how adults handle money while kids get emotional. He said I was lucky to live there. He said he had carried this house on his back for years. He said signing the paper would make everything easier. I watched his mouth move and focused on the small crack in the table near my thumb, the one I had noticed 100 times while paying the internet bill on my phone, the electricity bill, the insurance reminder emails. When someone believes they own the room, they talk too much. And paperwork does not care about pride. I knew that much. I folded the paper neatly and placed it back on the table. I did not argue. I did not cry. I did not explain myself. I laughed and let him keep talking. If you have ever been told to just sign something to keep the peace, comment, I know that feeling. Richard kept going. He said I did not even know what escrow meant. He said Brandon needed support right now, and we all had to pull together. He said money was respect, and respect had to be earned. Linda nodded faintly and said, "Let us not turn this into a thing." The words landed like small weights, one after another. I felt them, everyone pressing down, but I stayed quiet. I folded a napkin between my fingers until it creased, smoothed it out, and placed it beside my plate. I watched the news ticker crawl by on the TV, something about road construction downtown, and thought about how roads only get attention when they break. That night, after the dishes were done and everyone drifted to their corners of the house, I lay awake staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly above me. The sentence replayed in my head, "You will never touch my money again." It sounded final. It sounded like a door closing. What Richard did not know was that I had learned a long time ago not to panic when someone threatened me with money. I had learned to read contracts carefully. I had learned to keep my credit clean. I had learned to listen more than I spoke. I had learned that people who underestimate you often do the work for you if you let them. I laughed that night because I understood something he did not. He thought money meant control. I knew control meant knowing when to stop holding everything together, and I let him finish talking because the more he explained, the clearer it became where all the cracks were. This was not the end of something. It was the beginning of watching a man talk himself into trouble. After that night in March, nothing in the house changed on the surface, and that was almost worse. The morning still smelled like burnt coffee and toast. The driveway still creaked when Richard backed out too fast. The TV still played local news no one really listened to, but once a sentence like that is said out loud, it does not disappear. It settles. I had lived with that feeling before. My mom remarried Richard when I was 16, right after my junior year started. He moved into our lives with confidence, with opinions, with a sense that everything already had a proper place. From the beginning, I was never fully part of that place. I was an extra chair at the table. Not unwelcome exactly, just unnecessary. Richard never said it directly when I was younger. He did not need to. He showed it in smaller ways. He would introduce Brandon as his son and pause before saying my name like he had to remember where I fit. When family came over, he would ask Brandon about his plans, his ideas, his next move, and ask me if I was still in school or still working that office job. Still was always the word. Linda learned early how to smooth things over. Keep the peace became her answer to everything. When Richard made jokes about me not understanding money, she would laugh lightly and say he did not mean it like that. When Brandon needed help, she would say this is just a rough patch. When I stayed quiet, she would say, "You are so mature about these things." What she never said was, "Thank you." Brandon's rough patches came in waves. He would lose a job, then find something temporary, then lose interest. He would talk about big ideas that never quite landed. Each time, Richard stepped in without hesitation. I watched him pull out his wallet and pay off Brandon's credit card balances like it was nothing. I watched him cover late fees, car repairs, one emergency after another. He called it investing in potential. When I paid the electric bill on my phone at the kitchen counter, Richard walked past and said, "Make sure you do not forget you live here for free." I paid the internet bill every month because I worked from home 2 days a week. I paid it quietly without asking for credit. It never mattered. Living here for free became the phrase that erased everything I contributed. The first time I tried to point it out, I did it carefully. I said I pay the utilities. Richard did not even look up from his plate. Adults talk money, kids talk feelings. That was his way of ending the conversation. The tone was calm, almost patient, which somehow made it sharper. Linda cleared her throat and said, "Let us not argue at dinner." Brandon smirked and said he would forget his own head if someone did not remind him. That was how it always went. When Brandon needed help, it was responsibility. When I contributed, it was expected. When I asked questions, it was attitude. After the refinance paper appeared, Richard's control tightened in smaller ways. He started paying attention to things he had ignored before. One afternoon while I was checking an email from work, he asked to see my phone. He said he just wanted to check subscriptions. He said people waste money without realizing it. I handed it over because refusing would have turned into a bigger thing. He scrolled slowly, reading out loud. Streaming service, music app, a grocery delivery account. He shook his head and said these little things add up. Brandon laughed and said that is why she never has savings. I did not remind them that I had never missed a payment on anything in my life. Richard handed my phone back and said, "You should be grateful I'm looking out for you. You are lucky I let you stay." The word lucky landed heavier than he probably intended. It was a reminder that this was conditional. Everything was conditional. My presence, my voice, my right to ask questions. That night after everyone went to bed, I sat at the small desk in my room and sorted my papers the way I always did. I stacked bank statements in order. I slid tax documents into a plain folder I kept tucked behind a few old notebooks. I lined up insurance notices, pay stubs, anything with my name on it. I had always done this. It made me feel steady. Richard saw it once when he came in to borrow a pen. He glanced at the folder and laughed. "Little filing system will not make you rich." He said it like advice. I said nothing. Over the next few weeks, the comments came more often. Richard started narrating my life as if I was not there. He told Linda that I did not understand how expensive things were. He told Brandon that I would not last long on my own. He said it in front of me, never directly to me. When I came home late from work one evening, he asked where I had been and then joked that overtime must be nice when someone else pays the mortgage. Linda looked at me with that familiar expression, the one that asked me to let it go. Keep the peace. I nodded and went to my room. The humiliation was never loud. That was what made it familiar. It was the kind of humiliation people recognize years later when they try to explain why they stayed quiet for so long. It was being reminded daily that your effort did not count unless someone else decided it did. It was watching Brandon sleep in and still be treated like an investment while my consistency was treated like background noise. One Sunday afternoon, Richard mentioned again that I needed to sign the refinance paperwork soon. He said the delay was costing him money. He said this house was his responsibility, and he needed cooperation, not resistance. Brandon chimed in that I always made things harder than they needed to be. Linda said we should all just work together. I stood there listening and felt something shift. Not anger, exactly. Clarity. I realized that, in their version of this family, my role was to absorb pressure and smooth the edges. I was there to help quietly and disappear when it was convenient. That realization hurt, but it also explained everything. I stopped correcting them. When Richard misquoted numbers, I did not fix it. When he complained about expenses, I did not remind him what I covered. When Brandon joked about my job, I let it pass. The more I stayed quiet, the more confident Richard became. He mistook my silence for agreement. That was the dangerous part. The favoritism stopped feeling personal and started feeling procedural. It was a system that worked for them because I made it work. And the longer it went on, the clearer it became that they had no idea how much depended on me staying exactly where I was. I was still sitting at the same table, still paying my share, still keeping my papers in order, but I was no longer confused about my place. I was no longer trying to earn respect from people who believed it could only be bought. I was watching. And every comment, every small insult, every reminder that I was lucky to stay was another reason not to rush. Another reason to let them keep talking. By early April, the house had developed a new rhythm, one that revolved around Richard's voice. He talked more than he used to. Not louder, just longer, as if the sound of himself explaining things reassured him that everything was still under control. I started noticing it in the mornings when I passed the hallway and heard him on the phone behind the closed door of his home office. His tone shifted when he talked about money. It grew confident, almost relaxed. He mentioned interest rates like he had discovered them himself. He bragged about timing, about how you had to move fast before the market changed. I heard phrases drift out into the hall while I tied my shoes or waited for the coffee maker to finish. Cash out, roll it over, I will move it around. He said those words casually like furniture. He said them often enough that I stopped reacting. That was the point. At dinner, he started performing. He talked about the refinance as if it were already done, as if the paperwork was just a formality that people like me worried about too much. He told Linda that property taxes were due later this year, and that he had already accounted for it. I knew the date was wrong. I had paid attention to those notices every year. I did not correct him. Brandon leaned back in his chair and said his dad always knew how to work the system. Richard smiled and kept going. He talked about a home equity line like it was a trophy, something only smart people unlocked. He explained it twice, once for effect, once because no one stopped him. I ate slowly and listened. Let him finish talking. That sentence became a quiet instruction I repeated to myself. The more he explained, the more his story shifted. Dates moved. Numbers rounded themselves in convenient ways. He contradicted things he had said just days before, but no one else seemed to notice. Linda nodded and said it all sounded complicated. Brandon scrolled on his phone and added comments when it suited him. I stayed quiet. One night when the conversation paused just long enough, I asked a question. It was small, almost childlike. I kept my voice light. So whose name is the policy under? Richard looked at me like I had interrupted something important. Mine. Always mine. He said it with a smirk, like the answer should have been obvious. Brandon laughed and said, "See, she does not even know that." Linda sighed and said, "Can we please not turn this into another discussion?" The moment passed. Richard returned to his story. But the sentence stayed with me. Mine. Always mine. That was how he framed everything. Ownership as identity, control as certainty. Over the next few weeks, the pressure sharpened. Richard stopped hinting and started stating consequences. One afternoon, he told me he needed the car that weekend, and that if I wanted to use it in the future, I should probably cooperate more. He reminded me that I was not paying rent, and that if I wanted to keep things comfortable, I needed to stop making things difficult. The word "cut off" appeared for the first time. He said it casually, like a suggestion. "If you do not sign, I will have to cut you off." He listed things the way people do when they think they are being reasonable. No more car, higher rent, fewer favors. Brandon chimed in that it was about time I learned how expensive life really was. My chest tightened again, but I felt something else underneath it. Focus. The threats were meant to scare me, but they landed strangely flat. He was threatening me with things I already paid for or managed myself. I had always covered my share. I had never relied on him the way Brandon did. The difference was that Richard believed dependence was the only currency that mattered. That night, after everyone went to bed, I opened my laptop and checked my credit report. It was something I did quietly every few months, the way some people check the weather. The numbers were steady, no surprises, no missed payments. I closed the tab and felt the same calm I always did after confirming what I already knew. A few days later, an email arrived with the subject line "Quarterly Statement." I recognized the sender immediately. I did not open it at the kitchen table. I did not mention it. I let it sit until later. Breadcrumbs do not need announcements. Richard continued talking himself into corners. He complained that the bank was slow, that paperwork took too long when people did not understand urgency. He blamed delays on other people. He said things like, "They will figure it out, and I know how to handle them." Each time he spoke, he added another detail that did not quite line up with the last one. Linda grew quieter. She started saying, "Maybe we should just get this done." Brandon grew bolder. He joked that once the refinance went through, things would finally get easier. Easier for whom was never specified. One evening, Richard stood in the doorway of my room and said we needed to talk. He said if I did not sign soon, he would start charging me rent that reflected real market value. He said he was tired of carrying dead weight. The words stung, but they did not surprise me. I nodded and said I understood. He left, satisfied, convinced he had regained control. Have you ever watched someone threaten you with things you were already paying for? I sat on my bed after he left and thought about how familiar that feeling was. The threat itself mattered less than the assumption behind it. He assumed I was afraid. He assumed I did not know how to stand on my own. He assumed that pressure would make me fold. What he did not realize was that by pushing harder, he was revealing how little he actually knew about what held this house together. The escalation moved from words to actions quickly after that. He took the car keys one morning and said he needed them indefinitely. He left a note on the counter with a number he claimed was fair rent. It was high enough to sting, but low enough to feel intentional. Brandon joked that maybe I would finally move out and stop freeloading. Linda looked at me with that same pleading expression, and said, "Please do not make this harder than it needs to be." Each moment added weight. Each comment confirmed what I had already begun to understand. This was not about money, it was about obedience. The more I stayed quiet, the more Richard filled the silence with his own assumptions. He started correcting himself mid-sentence and then correcting the correction. He talked about the bank, about insurance, about permits. And each time he did, he exposed another gap. I did not rush to fill them. I let him finish talking. I moved carefully. I kept my routines. I paid what I always paid. I organized my papers and answered my emails privately. I did not argue. I did not explain. The house felt smaller, but my thinking felt clearer. Richard believed the threats would corner me. What they actually did was outline his expectations in plain language: sign or lose access, cooperate or be cut off. That clarity was useful. It showed me exactly where he thought the power lived, and it showed me how much he was counting on me not knowing any better. By late May, the picture finally came into focus, not all at once, but in the way ordinary truths do when you stop trying to look away. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon when I came home earlier than usual and found Richard pacing the living room with his phone pressed to his ear. He did not hear me come in. His voice was sharp, impatient. He said the numbers again, this time without the performance. He said he needed the cash out quickly. He said Brandon could not wait. He said the dealership was holding the car only through the end of the week. He laughed once short and tight and said this refinance was supposed to clean everything up. When he hung up, he turned and saw me standing there. For a split second, something flickered across his face. Then it was gone. He said Brandon was finally getting back on his feet. He said sometimes you have to invest in family. I nodded and went to my room carrying the weight of what I had just heard. It was not dramatic, it was not criminal. It was worse because it was so ordinary. He was using the house to pull out money to cover another one of Brandon's detours. A new car this time, maybe another half-planned business idea after that. And he wanted my signature to clean the paperwork, to make it look neat, to erase any question about who had a right to what. The realization settled slowly. This was not about refinancing to save money. It was about refinancing to move it, to shift risk, to make sure the consequences never landed where they belonged. That night, Richard brought it up again at dinner, more blunt this time. He said Brandon needed help now, not later. He said family shows up. He said my signature would make everything easier. Brandon looked at me and said, "You would not even feel it." Linda watched her hands and said, "Please do not make this into a fight." Something in me went quiet then. Not numb. Clear. I saw the pattern the way you see a map once you know where you are. I was not being asked to help. I was being asked to disappear on paper. The escalation followed naturally. Once Richard realized I was not rushing to sign, he stopped pretending. At a neighborhood barbecue in June, he told someone from down the street that I did not understand money, that I was more of a feelings person. He laughed when he said it like it was a harmless observation. Brandon chimed in and said she gets emotional about paperwork. A few people laughed politely. I stood there holding a paper plate and said nothing. At church the following Sunday, Richard mentioned to someone in passing that I was still living at home because the real world was expensive. He said it loud enough for me to hear. Linda smiled tightly and said we all have our journeys. I did not correct them. I did not defend myself. I let the words land where they landed. The humiliation was public now, casual, wrapped in humor. It was meant to push me back into place. Instead, it made my decision easier. I stopped doing the things that kept everything running smoothly. I did not announce it. I simply stopped. When an insurance notice came in the mail, I set it on the counter and walked past it. When a payment reminder popped up on my phone, I cleared the notification and did nothing. When Richard complained about a delay, I listened and said nothing. I stopped fronting money and waiting to be paid back. I stopped reminding anyone about deadlines. The house grew tense in a new way. Small problems appeared. A bill was late. A call went unanswered. Richard grew irritated and blamed everyone but himself. He asked why the insurance company had not called back. He asked why things were suddenly complicated. Brandon complained that everything felt unstable. Linda asked me quietly if I knew what was going on. I told her I was just staying out of it. The shift inside me was slower than the shift outside. I moved through my days with a careful calm, noticing how much effort it took to keep the peace and how little that effort was valued. The phrase replayed in my mind, "keep the peace." I had grown up believing it meant compromise. Now I understood it often meant letting someone else keep winning. That realization hurt more than any insult. It meant acknowledging how long I had participated in my own erasure. One evening in July, my phone buzzed with a message from a number saved without a name. Unit 14, B renewal signed. I replied with a simple thumbs up and set the phone down. No one in the room noticed. Richard was busy complaining about interest rates again. Brandon was talking about how hard it was to get ahead. Linda was watching the clock. I felt the quiet weight of that message settle into place. It was a reminder of something solid, something boring and steady that did not require anyone's permission. The threats continued. Richard raised the rent number again. He said if I wanted to stay, I would pay market value. He said he was tired of being taken advantage of. I listened. I felt the familiar sting, but it passed more quickly now. The power of the words had started to fade. What replaced it was a steady resolve. I was no longer trying to be understood. I was no longer trying to prove anything. I was stepping back and letting the gaps show. The closer Richard came to the breaking point, the more frantic his control became. He checked the mailbox more often. He snapped at Linda when she asked questions. He blamed Brandon when things did not line up. Each reaction pushed him closer to the edge he did not see. The system he relied on was fragile, held together by my quiet labor. Without it, the cracks widened. One afternoon after another tense exchange, I sat alone in my room and let the truth settle fully. Keeping the peace had cost me my dignity for years. It had taught me to absorb disrespect in exchange for temporary calm. I could see now how that bargain always ended. If keeping the peace ever cost you your dignity, hit subscribe. This one gets real. That thought was not anger. It was acceptance. I had done my part long enough. The stakes were clear now. The refinance was moving forward without my consent. The pressure was mounting. The public comments had crossed from jokes into humiliation. The house felt like a place I no longer fit, and that was fine. I did not need to argue my way out. I needed to stop holding everything together. Richard believed he was tightening the screws. What he was really doing was bringing himself closer to the moment where someone would ask a simple question he could not answer. And I was done protecting him from that moment. By the end of May, the confusion I had been living with hardened into something clearer and heavier. It was not a single dramatic discovery. It was a sequence of ordinary details lining up in a way that could no longer be ignored. One afternoon, I came home earlier than usual and heard Richard pacing in the living room, phone pressed tight to his ear, his voice low and sharp. He did not notice me at first. He talked about timing and urgency, about how the dealer would only hold the car until the end of the week. He laughed once the sound thin and impatient and said the cash out should have already cleared. He said this refinance was supposed to clean the paperwork so everything would look simple. When he finally turned and saw me, his expression shifted quickly back to neutral. He said Brandon was getting a fresh start. He said sometimes you had to help family get back on their feet. I nodded and walked past him, but the words followed me down the hall. The picture formed slowly but unmistakably. The refinance was not about lowering payments or planning for the future. It was about pulling money from the house to cover another one of Brandon's emergencies, this time a car he could not afford, and an idea he was already talking about like a business. Richard wanted my signature not because I mattered, but because it would clean the paperwork. It would remove any question about who had a right to anything if things went wrong. That realization did not come with anger. It came with a quiet sense of being finished. At dinner that night, Richard stopped pretending. He said Brandon needed help now. He said family showed up when it mattered. He said my signature would make everything easier. Brandon looked at me and said it would not even affect me. Linda kept her eyes on her plate and asked me not to turn it into a fight. Something in me went still. I saw the pattern clearly for the first time. This was not about sharing responsibility. It was about shifting risk away from the people who kept making the same mistakes. I did not argue. I did not explain. I stayed quiet and let the silence stretch until Richard filled it with more words. The escalation came quickly after that. Once Richard realized I was not rushing to comply, his tone sharpened in public. At a neighborhood barbecue with people standing around holding paper plates, he laughed and told someone that I did not really understand money, that I was more emotional than practical. Brandon added that I tended to overthink things. A few people smiled politely. I stood there and said nothing. The next Sunday at church, Richard mentioned casually that I was still living at home because the world was expensive, and not everyone was ready for it. He said it like an observation, not an insult, which somehow made it worse. Linda smiled tightly and changed the subject. I did not correct him. I did not defend myself. The humiliation moved from private comments to public framing, and I let it happen. Not because it did not hurt, but because I was done trying to manage their perception of me. That was when I stopped keeping the house running smoothly. I did not announce it. I did not make a point of it. I simply stepped back. When insurance mail arrived, I left it unopened on the counter. When payment reminders popped up on my phone, I dismissed them and went about my day. I stopped fronting money and waiting for reimbursement. I stopped reminding anyone about due dates. The effect was subtle at first. A call did not get returned. A payment was late. Richard complained that things were suddenly complicated. He asked why the insurance adjuster had not followed up. He blamed delays on other people. Brandon complained that everything felt unstable. Linda asked me quietly if I knew what was going on. I told her I was staying out of it. Inside, the shift was slower and more deliberate. I moved through my days with a steady calm, noticing how much effort I had put into keeping things functional, and how little that effort had been acknowledged. The phrase, "keep the peace," replayed in my mind, and I finally understood what it had cost me. Keeping the peace had meant absorbing disrespect so other people could stay comfortable. It had meant smoothing over problems that were not mine to fix. I realized then that keep the peace was often just another way of saying, let them keep winning. That realization hurt more than any of Richard's comments. It meant accepting how long I had been participating in my own erasure. In July, my phone buzzed with a short message from a number saved without a name. Unit 14, B renewal signed. I replied with a simple thumbs up and put the phone away. No one noticed. Richard was busy complaining about interest rates again. Brandon was talking about how hard it was to get ahead. Linda was watching the clock. The message sat quietly in my pocket, a reminder of something steady and boring and real that did not require anyone's approval. The threats continued. Richard raised the rent number again and said if I wanted to stay, I would pay market value. He said he was tired of being taken advantage of. I listened without reacting. The words still stung, but they no longer landed the way they once had. Their power had started to drain away. In its place was a clear understanding of what was happening. Richard believed he was tightening control. What he was actually doing was exposing how dependent everything had become on my quiet participation. The closer he came to his breaking point, the more frantic his behavior became. He checked the mailbox constantly. He snapped at Linda when she asked questions. He blamed Brandon when plans fell apart. Each reaction widened the cracks he refused to see. The system he relied on was fragile, held together by routines and reminders I had provided without comment for years. Without that support, it began to wobble. One evening after another tense exchange, I sat alone in my room and let the truth settle fully. I was done trading dignity for calm. I was done carrying other people's problems so they could avoid responsibility. If keeping the peace ever cost you your dignity, hit subscribe. This one gets real. That thought did not come with anger. It came with acceptance. The stakes were clear now. Richard was moving forward with the refinance without my consent. The pressure had shifted from private manipulation to public framing. The house no longer felt like a place where I belonged, and that was fine. I did not need to argue my way out. I needed to stop holding everything together. Richard thought he was forcing my hand. What he was really doing was bringing himself closer to a moment where someone would ask a simple question he could not answer. and I was finished protecting him from that moment. The meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday morning in early September at the community center in Dublin, Ohio, the kind of place with beige walls, folding chairs, and a coffee machine that never quite worked right. A paper sign taped to the door read, HOA and Lender Coordination Meeting in black marker. It was not dramatic. That was the point. This was how real consequences showed up. Richard walked in first, like he owned the room, nodding at no one in particular. Brandon followed a step behind, trying to look confident. Linda stayed close to Richard, her hands folded tight in front of her. I came in last and took a seat near the end of the table. Marta, the loan officer, sat across from us with a laptop open and a neat stack of papers at her side. Derek from the insurance company set down a folder thick with notes. Cal, the contractor, leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, smelling faintly of sawdust and coffee. A few empty chairs lined the wall. The hum of the vending machine filled the pauses. Marta started by explaining why we were there. She said they needed to verify payment history and responsibility before moving forward. She said there were discrepancies that had to be cleared up to avoid disputes later. Richard nodded impatiently and said he understood all of that, and that he had been handling everything. He spoke for me without looking at me. He said we were all on the same page. Derek opened his folder and mentioned a recent insurance claim involving roof damage and a minor water leak. He asked who had been coordinating the follow-ups and making the payments tied to that policy. Richard answered quickly, saying he had. He waved a hand like the details were boring. Cal shifted in his seat and said he had mostly been speaking with Tess about permits and scheduling. Richard cut him off and said that was just because she was home more. He smiled like he was smoothing over a misunderstanding. Marta typed as they talked. She asked clarifying questions about dates and account numbers. Richard answered with confidence that thinned as the questions became more specific. He mixed up months. He referred to payments as if they were all the same. Brandon leaned forward and added comments that did not help. Linda stared at the table. The pace picked up. Marta paused and looked up from her screen. She said there was one thing she needed to confirm before proceeding. She asked a simple question. Who has been making these payments for the last 18 months? The room went quiet. I stayed still. Richard did not hesitate, me, obviously. He said it with a laugh like the answer was insulting. Marta nodded once and turned her laptop slightly so we could all see the screen. She scrolled and then stopped. Actually, she said the payments are coming from Tess Callahan card and account. She reached for the stack of papers and slid one across the table. Payment history. Cal leaned forward and said, yeah, she is the one who kept calling about the permits, too. Derek added that the insurance policy listed Tess as the primary contact for follow-ups and documentation. The air changed. Richard froze. Brandon looked at Linda. Linda went pale. No one spoke for a moment. The coffee machine clicked in the background. Marta waited patiently. I did not smile. I did not raise my voice. I looked at Richard and let the silence do the work. You told me I would never touch your money. Funny because I have been holding the whole thing up. The words were not loud. They did not need to be. Richard opened his mouth and then closed it. He said something about internal arrangements. Marta said they would need to reassess responsibility moving forward. Derek said they would update their records. Cal leaned back again and crossed his arms. The meeting moved on, but the damage was done. If your stomach just dropped right there, leave a comment because I felt it too. Richard tried to regain control by talking faster. He said misunderstandings happen. He said paperwork can be confusing. He said family should not air things like this. Marta listened and took notes. Derek gathered his folder. Brandon stared at his phone. Linda wiped at her eyes. The humiliation was not loud. It was complete. The proof sat on the table in black and white. Payment records do not care about pride. When the meeting ended, people stood and gathered their things. Marta said she would follow up with next steps. Derek said he would be in touch. Cal nodded at me once before leaving. Richard lingered as if waiting for someone to rescue the moment. No one did. We walked out into the parking lot where the sun was too bright for how heavy everything felt. Richard said we needed to talk. Linda said please. Brandon said this did not have to be a big deal. I said nothing. The public exposure had already happened. It did not need commentary. The value of that room was not in the embarrassment alone. It was in the way ordinary records told the truth without malice. There was no judge. No dramatic reveal. Just a question answered honestly. The power shifted because it was never about shouting. It was about who actually carried the weight when no one was looking. The tone changed before we even reached the car. Richard slowed his pace and dropped his voice as if the parking lot itself were listening. He said we were family and that things said in meetings did not need to define us. He said what happened inside did not have to follow us home. I kept walking. He followed and said I had embarrassed him. He said that part louder. He said people would talk. He said I should have handled it privately. The words came out in the same order they always did. Family first, image second, responsibility never. Brandon joined in before we reached the end of the row. He said the bank had put the refinance on hold. He said the dealership was calling. He said the car might be taken back if something did not change soon. He said he just needed a little help to get through this rough patch. Linda stood between us with tears already forming. She said, please just help once more. She said it was not worth tearing the family apart over paperwork. She said things would calm down if I just did this one thing. I listened without interrupting. The words did not land the way they once had. They floated past me like something I had already decided not to carry. We got home and the conversation continued in the kitchen where everything else had always happened. Richard leaned against the counter and said he never meant to hurt me. He said I took things too personally. He said I should have understood his position as the head of the household. He said men carried pressure women did not see. Brandon sat at the table and stared at his phone, pretending to be calm while refreshing messages. Linda cried quietly and said she was tired. The air felt thick with expectation. They were waiting for me to soften. They were waiting for the version of me that would absorb the discomfort and fix the problem so they did not have to change anything. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue details. I said one sentence. I thought I was not supposed to touch your money. The room went still. Richard blinked as if he had not heard me correctly. He said that was not what he meant. He said I was twisting his words. He said I knew what he meant. I repeated nothing. The silence stretched. Brandon slammed his phone down and said this was not the time to be petty. He said I was ruining his life over pride. Linda reached for my hand and said, please, just this once. I pulled my hand back gently. Richard's face hardened. He said if I was going to be like this, then I could not stay here. He said he would not have someone under his roof who undermined him. He said I had 1 week to figure something else out. The threat landed exactly where it was meant to. And it did nothing. I nodded and said okay. That seemed to unsettle him more than any argument would have. He asked where I would go. I said I had it handled. He scoffed and said I would be back. He said the real world was expensive. I said nothing. That night I packed what I needed. Not everything, just what mattered. Clothes folded neatly, documents placed carefully into the same folder I always kept. I had already arranged a temporary place to stay. I had already mapped out what came next. The plan had been forming quietly for months. There was no rush now. Over the next few days, the messages came. Brandon texted late at night saying the bank would not budge. He said the car company was sending notices. He said he just needed a bridge. Linda called in the afternoons crying and saying she did not recognize her family anymore. She said Richard was under so much stress. She said maybe if I apologized, things could go back to normal. Richard sent one message that read, "We need to talk." I did not reply. The consequences unfolded quickly. Without the refinance, the cash did not appear. The car was taken back. Brandon blamed everyone but himself. Richard grew angrier and louder. He told anyone who would listen that I had betrayed them. He said I had chosen money over family. The irony did not need explanation. The stakes became real in ways they had always avoided. Bills did not move themselves. Problems did not disappear when ignored. Linda tried one last time to convince me. She showed up where I was staying and said she needed help. She said she did not know how they would manage. I looked at her and told her I loved her. I told her I could love her without saving her. That was the hardest part. Not the confrontation, not the threats, the letting go. Ever notice how people only call it family when they need something? The distance gave me clarity. The audacity of their return was not shocking anymore. It was predictable. What mattered was that I did not step back into the role they had assigned me. The boundary held. The fallout was not dramatic. It was practical. Richard lost leverage. Brandon lost his safety net. Linda was forced to see the cost of keeping the peace for so long, and I moved forward with the quiet certainty of someone who had already done the hardest work. I moved out quietly in late October, into a small apartment on the north side of Columbus, close enough to work that my mornings felt lighter again. The place was nothing special. One bedroom, thin walls, a kitchen that smelled faintly like fresh paint and old coffee. I liked it because it was mine. I bought a cheap lamp from a thrift store and set it next to the couch. I unpacked slowly and deliberately. There was no rush. Peace does not need speed. The silence felt different here, not empty, earned. Richard felt the consequences almost immediately. The refinance never went through the way he had planned. Without clear responsibility and with payment records no longer lining up neatly, the bank tightened terms and then paused altogether. Contractors stopped returning calls as quickly. HOA emails became shorter and colder. Insurance follow-ups took longer. Nothing dramatic happened. That was the point. Reputation erodes quietly when people realize you talk more than you handle. Brandon had no buffer left. Without easy money to lean on, he had to deal with the fallout of his own choices. The car was gone. The startup idea dissolved as quickly as it had appeared. He complained loudly about bad timing and unfair systems. No one rushed in to rescue him. Linda called me a few weeks later. Her voice was tired. She said she did not know how things had gotten so heavy. She said Richard was angry all the time now. She said she wished things could go back to how they were. I listened. I told her I loved her. I told her I could love her without saving her. There was a long pause on the line. She did not argue. She did not thank me. She just breathed and said she hoped I was doing okay. I was. The days settled into a rhythm. Work, grocery store, evening walks. I paid my bills on time and slept better than I had in years. In early November, I drove to a small mini-storage property on the outskirts of Columbus for a scheduled meeting. The office was modest. A desk, a chair, a framed notice about office hours. The property manager greeted me with a smile and called me Ms. Callahan. We went over a few documents together. Nothing flashy, just signatures and dates and confirmations. He handed me a small set of keys and explained the next steps. I thanked him and stepped outside into the cool air, holding the weight of them in my palm. Later that week, an email arrived with the subject line quarterly statement. I opened it at my kitchen table this time. I scanned the numbers and closed the laptop without ceremony. My birthday was coming up. 26 felt closer now. I thought about the meeting months earlier and the look on Richard's face when the record spoke. I did not laugh because I had won. I laughed because I finally stopped begging for a seat at a table I was already building. That truth settled in me like a deep breath. You can live 30 years holding everything together without anyone noticing until you stop being the one who keeps it running. That is when people finally see what your silence was worth. If this story hit a place you do not talk about, you are not alone. Subscribe for the next one.